Today, we'll explore the deadliest bird's opening ideas and learn how to launch a powerful kingside attack right from the opening that can completely crush black in just a few moves. We begin with pawn to f4. Before getting into specific lines, it's important to understand the purpose behind this move. The key idea is to take control of the e5 square. Controlling e5 is the foundation of the bird's opening and shapes our plans for the entire game. Usually, our next moves are knight to f3 to reinforce control over e5, followed by bishop to b2 to place even more pressure on that central square. Since we dominate e5 so well, we often aim to plant a knight there later in the game. A knight securely posted on e5 can become extremely powerful and difficult for black to challenge. Now let's examine black's possible responses. Against most setups, your strategy remains fairly straightforward, except when black immediately strikes with pawn to e5, the aggressive Fromm's gambit. While it may not be the most accurate defense objectively, it becomes very dangerous if white doesn't know the correct ideas, and quick mating attacks can appear out of nowhere. When black chooses e5, the best approach is to accept the gambit. The main issue is that the diagonal toward our king becomes weakened, giving black tactical opportunities. Black's strongest continuation is usually pawn to d6. We capture the pawn, black recaptures, and suddenly both the queen and bishop start aiming aggressively toward our position. The correct reaction is knight to f3 right away, blocking dangerous queen ideas and improving our defense. From here, black generally has two important continuations. If black develops with bishop to g4, pinning the knight, it actually isn't very threatening. We can calmly respond with pawn to e3, allowing the queen to support the knight. After a move such as knight to c6, continue with bishop to e2. If black develops with knight to f6, simply castle kingside. Then continue your normal setup with pawn to b3 and bishop to b2. At this stage, white remains a pawn ahead. The position may feel slightly cramped, but black lacks sufficient compensation, which makes the bishop to g4 line relatively harmless. The more critical continuation is pawn to g5, called the Lasker variation. Although the move looks strange at first, black's idea is simple. Follow up with pawn to g4, chase away the knight, and create attacking chances using the queen. The safest response is pawn to g3, shutting down the dangerous diagonal and reducing tactical threats immediately. Black will usually continue with pawn to g4, attacking the knight. In reply, move the knight to h4 at the edge of the board. In this position, black still struggles to prove enough compensation for the sacrificed pawn. From here, black mainly has two serious continuations. The first is bishop to e7, directly targeting our knight. We can't allow black to capture it under favorable circumstances because their queen would invade our position and the attack could become overwhelming. That's why we retreat the knight to g2, the exact reason we prepared g3 earlier. Black's strongest attacking plan now is pushing pawn to h5 followed by h4. Against this, play pawn to d4, opening the bishop and improving defensive coordination. If black continues with h4, don't capture the pawn. Taking it would activate black's bishop and queen, giving their attack new life. Instead, develop with bishop to f4, supporting the g2 square and stabilizing the position. Once the attack fades, black is simply left down material without enough compensation, and white should gradually take over the game. That's how you deal with bishop to e7, but black's second major option in this mainline position is knight to e7, simply developing the knight. The problem for black is that their kingside becomes very exposed, making castling there almost impossible. Here, the move you want to play is pawn to d4, and there's an important reason for this immediate advance. After knight to g6, trying to trade knights, you'll capture the knight, and once black recaptures, a threat appears. Black can win your pawn because the rook is pinning it. To stop this idea, play queen to d3, which is exactly why we pushed d4 earlier. Now the pawn is fully protected. From here, continue with pawn to c3 and bishop to g2. Later, you'll reroute your knight toward e4. Even though black still has some activity with the pawn on g4 and the open h-file, they simply don't have enough compensation for their structural weaknesses. Personally, I don't think black has full compensation for the pawn, and white should have very good chances in this position. That's the proper way to meet pawn to e5, the Fromm's gambit, so it's important to know this variation well. Now, let's move on to black's other possible responses. Black has many choices here, including d5, c5, knight to f6, knight to c6, d6, or e6. The main thing to remember is that, against almost every move except pawn to e5, your setup stays very similar. Let's take pawn to d5 as an example. Your first move should be knight to f3, increasing control over the e5 square while developing naturally. After black responds, continue with pawn to b3. You can already see the ideas we mentioned earlier coming together. You constantly build more pressure on e5. Next, develop the bishop to b2, keeping strong influence over e5 and improving your overall position. This setup works very well against most of black's responses in the bird's opening. Now black develops with knight to c6, and you answer with bishop to b2. One of the biggest advantages of controlling e5 so effectively is that black's central break with e5 becomes very difficult to achieve, which is excellent news for white. If black manages to push e5 comfortably, your position could become unpleasant. Now, more commonly, black continues with knight to f6. You should then play pawn to e3, opening the bishop and preparing to place it on b5. The purpose is to exchange black's knight, weakening their influence over e5 and making your control of that square even stronger. At this stage, black has many different options, but let's use pawn to e6 as an example. No matter what black chooses, your setup remains very consistent. After e6 or a similar move, continue with bishop to b5. This pins the knight and prepares to trade it off, further strengthening your control over e5. This setup is very reliable and can be used against nearly every common response black chooses in the bird's opening. If black tries to challenge you with pawn to a6, it's actually not a very good move because you already intended to capture the knight anyway. After the exchange on c6, black is left with doubled c-pawns, which are usually a weakness in this type of position. While doubled pawns can sometimes be useful in other openings, here they tend to create long-term problems. Simply castle, and white should enjoy a comfortable edge. A stronger approach for black is bishop to d7, breaking the pin and preparing to recapture with the bishop once you eventually take on c6. And sooner or later, you will usually exchange that knight, or another important piece around that area. At this point, simply castle. If black continues with bishop to e7, preparing to castle as well, you should respond with pawn to d3. The idea is to reroute your knight to d2 and eventually place it on e5. After that, the other knight can come to f3, allowing both knights to coordinate and completely control the e5 square. Now black will usually castle, and you continue with knight to d2. At this moment, black often plays pawn to a6, inviting you to capture. Since exchanging was already part of the plan, you take the knight. After black recaptures, immediately jump into the center with knight to e5, attacking the bishop. Technically, black's best defensive move is bishop back to a8, but realistically, almost nobody wants to play such a passive move. Instead, the most natural response is queen to c7, protecting the bishop. Here, white has several strong plans available. You can continue with knight d2 to f3, strengthening the knight on e5 and maintaining full control over the center. Another option is queen to f3, bringing the queen toward the king side for attacking chances. But the most dangerous idea is lifting the rook with rook to f3. The goal is to swing the rook over to g3 or h3 and launch a direct kingside attack alongside the queen. This strategy works especially well because black's pawn structure makes it difficult for their pieces to defend the kingside effectively. For instance, if black retreats with knight to d7, which is a very common move, you can immediately pressure that knight and prepare pawn to f6. This further increases your grip over e5 while creating dangerous attacking threats. Continue with rook to g3, and if black answers with pawn to f6, simply play queen to g4. At this point, white is already winning. The threat of queen takes g7 is devastating, and black has no good defense. After rook to f7, knight captures, king captures, and queen captures on g7, white is completely winning. If black instead tries pawn to d4 to activate the bishop, respond with pawn to e4. Even though this temporarily blocks your own bishop, black's pieces also become passive. Their bishop and knight are stuck staring into pawns, while your attack on the king side continues naturally. Bring the rook to g3 or h3, add the queen into the attack, and white gets excellent attacking chances from this position.